Hello everyone, and welcome to our live webinar presentation this afternoon. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. Before we kick off, you can download a copy of the slides below. Then please take a moment to read through the disclaimer. Just to reiterate that I'm not giving you any investment advice today, but rather a framework for you to think about your retail sector investment decisions. So without any further ado, let's get into the three global forces that I think will ultimately resulted in Forever21 entering a Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection process on Sunday, and what that means for Mr. Price, Pepkor, TFG, Truworths, and Woolworths. So here is the outline of what we will discuss today. Please type any questions you have into the question box. I will pause regularly to look at them and will answer as many as I can. So let's focus on Forever21 first. Many of you will know that their stores either from seeing or shopping in their outlets in South Africa or overseas. The business was founded in 1984 by a South Korean couple who had recently emigrated to the United States. Now, why am I picking on the founding date? For the simple reason that this business has grown up with the millennials, and as we go through this presentation, you'll see why that's important. And they built their business around how they interpreted the American dream. Forever21 has remained privately owned by the family, and the two daughters, who both attended Ivy League universities, both work in the business too. The concept is a fast fashion retailer. So that means frequent landings of fresh, new, very fashionable stock in the stores, and the ranges tend to be reasonably limited and turn over fast. So scarcity and don't miss out on the latest look are important pillars of the business model. Forever21 focused its niche quite narrowly on young fashion, and particularly the teen and young adult market. I'll show you a chart a bit later that shows you the growth in the group's store base over time. Between 1984 and 2005, it opened 370 stores, of which just 7 were outside the US. But then the Great Recession presented it with what seemed to be an offer that was just too good to refuse. Choice retail sites became available in places regarded as shopping meccas globally, and the Chang family took the opportunity. Store numbers peaked in 832 in 2017, with just over 300 stores located outside the US. The Great Recession also benefited the group's value positioning, as consumers looked for more cost-effective ways to get their fashion fix. And so the group grew. Its revenues peaked in 2014 at $4.1 billion US, and at that point it employed 43,000 people. So what went wrong? I think the first problem was the pace of expansion. We have seen before that retailers can grow too fast. Their management can't keep control of the growth in store numbers, in IT infrastructure, staff, and stock, and it all comes unstuck. But there were other factors at play too. Firstly, the global supply chain in the fashion space has become relentlessly more efficient since the global financial crisis. And the shorter supply chain means that there is very limited room for error. If you make the wrong trend call, it's hard to reverse the decision without having committed to stock. The second issue is that although the group managed to get space in destination shopping areas it probably would not have got without the financial crisis, that space was generally for very large stores with incredibly long leases. And that meant it couldn't respond to the effects of the growth of e-commerce. So I hope you noticed there that I didn't say e-commerce was the problem. Instead, I think the problem was the group's limited ability to shrink its bricks and mortar business as online grew. We'll come back to the e-commerce factor a bit later. And then the last issue is that the group used debt to grow. This table shows you the breakdown of the group's debt as it went into Chapter 11 on Sunday. The total was $227.7 million, or almost 3.5 billion rand, mostly in a bank-financed revolving credit facility. That ABL facility was actually what sparked the crisis, as lenders froze it as they became concerned that suppliers would demand upfront cash payments. Forever21 had actually been working on a restructuring plan at least since June, as it had hoped to avoid Chapter 11. Now, why am I highlighting the debt? After all, financial theory tells us that companies absolutely should use debt to leverage their growth. And I'm not having a fight here with debt that is reasonable levels, and by that I mean 2 times EBITDA or under. But debt of kind of 3.5 to 4 times EBITDA and more is a problem. Why? They are a real fashion, and those high debt levels seem to be a particularly toxic combination. I can only think that it's because fashion by itself is inherently risky. And if you take your risk on your balance sheet, then it becomes quite hard to take it in your stores. So that's why I think it's no coincidence that South Africa's most successful fashion retailers are arguably Mr. Price and Truworths. And Mr. Price has a hefty cash pile, and Truworths is ungeared in South Africa. So before we dive into the three structural forces that I think are really behind the decline of Forever 21 and so many other clothing retailers in the US and Europe, let's take a quick look beyond the headlines at Chapter 11. So the first point to note is that this is not bankruptcy. Chapter 11 is designed to give companies some breathing space so that they can avoid bankruptcy. Sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. But it's a legal mechanism that forces parties like landlords, suppliers, and banks to the negotiating table to make concessions around things like payment terms or rents. Forever 21's Chapter 11 filing outlines its plans to shrink itself back to health. It will close up to 350 of its international stores and up to 178 stores in the US. Okay, so let's stop here for questions. Are you saying that e-commerce was not a factor in Forever 21's decline? No, not quite, and I hope I will explain this better further on in this presentation. My view is that it's been the retailer's inability to respond through being able to scale back store sizes and numbers quickly that's the key issue. So the impact of e-commerce on footfall and top line is a symptom of some of the underlying problems that the sector faces rather than a root cause. And we're about to discuss one of those really important underlying problems right now. We'll move on to the first of what I think are the three structural causes of Forever 21's decline. This is what I've termed global fashion being stuck. And by that, I mean that there have been very little newness or big changes in fashion trends from one season to the next, or even from 1 year to the next, since the global financial crisis hit in 2008. So what is my evidence for saying that fashion has been unexciting and lacked that special something for the past 10 years? The first key bit of evidence is the commentary from the large global retailers. H&M and Inditex, which own Zara, are the two fast fashion bellwethers. Their quarterly results comments have included downbeat assessments of current fashion trends as reasons for their own soft comparable store sales growth many times in the past 10 years. In some ways, I think the spread of these large players itself is part of the problem. They've gone overseas seeking growth because of aging populations in Europe, mean that their addressable markets there at home are shrinking. One thing that creates cutting-edge fashion is when communities use their dress as a way of giving themselves a visual identity. Of course, it doesn't have to be geographic, but it can be. Then the other key reason comes back to my earlier comment about how debt and fashion don't always mix. One of the consequences of low interest rates and quantitative easing is that many corporates have geared up their balance sheets. It's by no means true across the board, but it's interesting that Inditex, which I think has done a better fashion job than many of its large peers despite its size, is in a net cash position. But every single troubled fashion retailer in the US and Europe has been very heavily indebted. Let me say it again. Fashion and debt are like oil and water. They can't mix, and if you try, there could be an inferno. Then the other reasons for the lack of newness are, I think, directly linked to the global financial crisis. Since then, the world has become quite a scary place, and retailers' in-house fashion designers are like the rest of us. They don't go out on creative limbs if they're feeling threatened or insecure. So combine that global insecurity with the close-to-home feeling of wondering about your own long-term job security, and it's no wonder that very few are pushing the envelope. And lastly, we've seen consumers spending less on clothes. Part of this is due to less credit availability and paying more attention to budgets, but there's also an underlying trend towards buying fewer, better quality or investment pieces. We'll touch on some of the reasons for this as we go. It's not all about budgets. So what did that mean for Forever 21? Forever 21 took its fashion offer that appealed to a segment of young adult suburban Americans and assumed that young consumers in places as diverse as Spain and China would like it too. Don't get me wrong, some did. The world is a smaller place than it's ever been, and it's easier and easier to find people with whom you share ideas and identity, and yes, fashion sensibilities. But there were not enough, especially in Asia, and so the stock didn't move. The Chapter 11 filing makes a telling observation that the group underbought stock in 2018 because it had overbought the year before. Did any of you react to that? They didn't mark down and clear what wasn't moving. They were satisfied that they would be able to sell it as the new season's fashionable merchandise, because the underlying fashion trend would have tweaked rather than reinvented itself. And consumers get bored if there's no differentiation. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the question box as they occur to you, and I'll stop to answer them regularly. We're going to move on to the second structural force now. Some of you have heard me say before that demographics is everything, but now we're on the cusp of something globally that could be better described as demographics on steroids, and that is what I've called generational change. The problem is that the structural and unstoppable force is going to play out very differently in different parts of the world. So the first point to note is that the share of the consumer wallet shifts over time. In the US, clothing and footwear share of wallet has been in a long-term structural decline. It accounted for 2.8% of total US consumer spend in 2018, from 8% at the beginning of the 1960s. Just to put this in context, the market's value would be 54% larger if it had maintained the 4.2% spend share it enjoyed in 2000. This is partly due to clothing deflation, which has been a long-term global trend, and in turn that was probably partly due to the advent of fast fashion and the notion of disposable clothing. But it could have been worse. Food share of wallet went from 18.9% in 1960 to 7.2% in 2018. So what's displaced these? And what we're really seeing here is consumer trends and about generations. So the two big drivers here are going to be the baby boomers and the millennials. So healthcare has been the biggest displacer, and you can really relate that to the baby boomers and the need for more health care as you grow older. But you can also see the effect of the baby boomers realizing that they needed to finance what are going to be long retirements. And then more latterly, the millennials shift away from stuff to experiences in the recreation services green line. The millennials are now a bigger group than the baby boomers, and so are now the most important consumer group for US-based businesses. But if you are a youth-focused fashion brand, the millennials are no longer your customers. The millennials are now too old. In fact, the oldest of them are now the parents of youthful fashion retailers' new customers. Generation Z, if you speak American, or Generation Z to the rest of us. These are the teenagers who are rebelling against their parents by not drinking, not smoking, not swearing, and getting straight A's in school. I exaggerate, but you get the point. These are consumers whose psyche is completely different to anything we've seen before. They're highly educated. In the West, 1 in 2 is likely to receive some form of tertiary education. They're digital citizens. They're also called the I generation. They can't imagine a world without a smartphone, let alone a cell phone. And this digital connectedness means that the traditional American blinkedness about the rest of the world is no longer true either. The digital use has a dark side, though. It also means they're more isolated, stressed and depressed than previous generations. And in the US, this has been exacerbated by their age. Many were born after 9/11, and many of those who were alive then don't remember it. And they've grown up in a country loudly engaged in a war on terror. And then there's a small detail of the psychological toll that mass school shootings must take. They are diverse. In the US, there are more mixed parentage Generation Z children than we've seen before, and they are entrepreneurial. They have the examples of the millennials disrupting old industries and creating not just new companies and industries, but economies. So fair to say, their mindset is different to that of the millennials, and they're not going to respond to the same fashion or marketing messages. There isn't just one Greta Thunstrom. There are hundreds of millions of them, and they are youthful fashion retailers' new customers, and they are here now. Right, this generational change is showing itself up in changes in consumer mindset, and these changes are also impacting how consumers interact with brands. These include heightened concerns about climate change and what actions individuals can take. Clothing manufacture is extremely water intensive. A number of retailers are responding by implementing more sustainable business practices. There seems to be growing concern about brands behaving fairly in terms of how workers involved in making their products are treated, that no child labor is used, and that copyrights are respected and protected. Consumers have also become less trusting of especially large corporates. This is partly due to the rise of increased data tracking and its use by brands for marketing. But there are other reasons, like food labeling issues and data breaches. Being constantly plugged in means that consumers are demanding ever more instant gratification. For retailers, this implies pressure for ever shorter supply chains to translate that catwalk into shelf-ready product and quicker online fulfillment. And there absolutely are costs to this. And coupled with an increasing reticence to spend on new clothes, which is partly allied to eco concerns and partly to the swing to owning less stuff directly, it seems that there may be further global, industry-wide margin pressure to come, given the likelihood of soft top lines and rising costs. So, what about e-commerce? There is no doubt that online has taken massive share. In the US, it now accounts for over 34% of apparel sales. The consequence has been that more foot traffic has dropped, and margins have been squeezed as retailers couldn't cut their overhead fast enough. And of course, logistics costs, including how to deal with returns, added an extra layer of costs. But as the chart here on the right-hand side shows you, the actual size of the bricks and mortar clothing market has not grown much relative to 1995, although there has been huge expansion of store footprint in the past 25 years. But here's the core of why I think e-commerce is a symptom rather than a cause of the structural change in the market. If clothing had maintained its 2000 share of wallet, then the bricks and mortar market would now be considerably larger, even if online had grown to the same 34.4% share of that bigger pie. So circling back to Forever 21, it has largely been on the wrong side of a number of the implications of this generational change. Perhaps because it is private and family owned, it doesn't seem to have felt the need to play for its customers' minds as well as their hearts. There have been repeated legal cases alleging copycat products. To date, these have been settled out of court, but read a few Forever 21 blog rants and see how a small but vocal minority of ex-customers hated this. It has not contributed visibly in tackling industry-wide issues such as garment manufacturer abuses. For example, it was allegedly one of the retailers that had clothes made in Rana Plaza, the Bangladeshi factory that burnt down, killing over 100 people in 2013. Unlike many others, it has not made any financial contribution to the victims. It has taken little visible action on climate change. This is in sharp contrast to a number of other global fashion names that have, including signing the new Fashion Retaile Climate Pact in August this year. Forever 21 was also strongly criticized in Asia for not interpreting its fashion to fit local tastes, and it is only now addressing its least issues, partly enabled by the Chapter 11 process. Okay, so let's stop for questions before we move on to the own goal force, which I've called management over ambition. Okay, you've all been very quiet suddenly. All right, so there is very little doubt in my mind that a large chunk of Forever 21's problems were caused by an overly aggressive international expansion. As this chart shows, the US store base was relatively flat after 2010 as the group focused on expanding internationally. So just to reiterate, fashion needs to be about group identity. So by definition, there can't be a one-size-fits-all the Kardashians are wearing it answer that speaks to everyone, although there will of course be a wide base of fans for anything the Kardashians do wear. So fashion should have some distinguishing characteristics that speak to a specific group. The internet and social media make it easier than ever to reach niche audiences, and so I don't think this fragmentation of fashion is likely to disappear. If anything, we may well see more of it. Forever 21 does not appear to have tweaked its offer for local tastes, and so the product did not have any mass appeal in Asia or in Europe. Okay, so let's stop for questions before we look at how these three structural forces affect the South African players. Do you think Woolworth's acquisition of David Jones falls into the category of management over ambition? Yes, I do think there was an element of that, although I do think the intention to defend against the management over ambition of players such as Inditex and H&M was also a factor. So we basically have had a domino effect of management over ambition responding to other management over ambition, if you like. Right, let's look at what this all means for the South African market. So the first thing is that Forever 21 is a minuscule player in the local market. It has 3 stores. They are franchised rather than corporate stores, and this map from the Chapter 11 filing implies that they are here to stay. So please don't anyone think that there is lots of market share up for grabs for the other players, because Forever 21 is about to close down. In the next few slides, I'm going to score each of the retailers in terms of how exposed they are to a specific force. A score to the right means that that retailer is relatively highly exposed to that risk, while a score to the left means that there's a relatively small exposure. As far as fashionability is concerned, I think Mr. Price and Truworths are most sensitive, while Pepkor has the lowest proportion of fashion in its mix. Right, to look at generational change, we need to start with demographics, and there are some powerful shifts ahead for South Africa. This chart shows the 5-year growth of the absolute number of South Africans in each age group. So the 2015 bar shows the change in number of people compared to 2010. 2020 shows the change relative to 2015, and so on. And you can see here how South Africa's population will now age significantly. The bottom line is that by 2030, the 24-year-old and under population will have shrunk to close to 40% of the population in terms of the UN's forecasts. In 2000, this group is close to 55% of South Africa's people. From an investment perspective, we need to look at what we can expect in the next 5 years. So here's the picture. There will be a very small positive change in children under 15 population, but this is driven by the 10 to 14-year-olds. The population of children under 9 will reduce. The 15 to 24-year-old market will grow quite nicely. The 25 to 34-year-old market will shrink in absolute terms, and the 35 plus age groups will grow in double digits. So I think Truworths is the most exposed to the decline in the 25 to 34 age group, while Pepcor's focus on kidswear means that it is not positioned in the high growth parts of the market. Conversely, I think Woolworths is actually best positioned for where consumers will grow in absolute numbers. And then looking at the last force, management overambition, I guess I don't have to explain the Woolworths score after the earlier question, but I think it is important to note that these management teams have pursued international growth strategies, at least partly in response to South Africa's soft growth environment. TFG and Woolworths and Truworths have made international acquisitions, and clearly Office has been a disappointment, although on a more palatable scale than David Jones. And Mr. Price managed the risk around its Greenfields operation well, and it didn't let ego get in the way of making the hard decisions to firstly downsize and then ultimately close the stores. Right, so we've got a couple of questions here. What is your view about how the second-hand clothing market has affected growth of the clothing market globally, and what about in South Africa? Okay, so this is a really good question, but there's not a lot of data, unfortunately. What we do know is that more and more trend magazines, consumer surveys are showing it, and that particularly in the UK, there seems to be a lot of thrift market recycling. In South Africa, I think it's fair to say that it absolutely does play a role, but again, I haven't seen any stats. My gut feel, bearing in mind what we've seen in terms of down trading in across the board, really, in food and in clothing in the past 5 to 7 years, has been that we absolutely, well, that it's very, very likely that the second-hand clothing market has grown its market share as a proportion in the past few years. If you've got any further questions on that, please just type them in there. And then historically, how has downscaling of department stores performed? Any success stories? I think the department stores are dealing with more than just a big size. They're also dealing with a very convoluted assortment and not necessarily good curating of those. There are some success stories, although they are few and far between, admittedly. John Lewis in the UK arguably is one success story, but the one that I think is the global success story is a company called Isitan in Singapore. It is private, so they're not in the public eye, and that probably helps as well. Okay, please let me know if you've got any follow-up questions here. All right, so let's just have a look at some of the consequences of these coming changes. Firstly, we will see some changes to business models. Some could be wholesale, but I imagine mostly there will be tweaks around the fashion offer, making it more South African, and that the currently quite neglected 40-plus fashion market could get a whole lot more attention. I'm hoping so anyway. But despite the very tough environment, I suspect it means that we will continue to see more players entering the market. Not necessarily national players, I hasten to add, but local players. So it's not going to get less competitive anytime soon, assuming that the EdCon turnaround is successful. Okay, so let's pull this all together. Here is the sum of the 3 previous assessments. I was surprised to see that Truworths looks like it is potentially the most exposed to these three forces, and Pepcore is the most offensive way to play these trends. Right, I also think I need to say that I'm not going to ring the gong here on fast fashion. There are some very interesting challenges to the business model emerging, and ultimately consumer tastes may force a change to a mindset that assumes you can sell an unlimited number of items to fashion-hungry consumers because they are cheap, because they are disposable, and most of all, different to the existing wardrobe. South Africa generally doesn't play in the bleeding edge fashion space, but to be honest, I don't think too many places do right now. And there are some innovative, quirky, beautiful, and differentiated local fashion retailers who are making astounding use of social media to speak to their customers. And then lastly, South Africa's demographics for the next 10 years are not that helpful to retailers playing in the youthful fashion market. So it's going to be interesting to see how proactive they are in responding. Right, so in conclusion then, these three structural forces are at work in fashion retail, both globally and locally. And as I've shown you, I think Truworths is most exposed, but of course you can come to a different conclusion with what I've shown you. What is clear is that the management teams are going to be working in an environment that's very different in the next decade to the past decade. So look for the ones that are responsive to market changes, are prepared to disrupt their own existing businesses if necessary, are nimble and good at executing, and above all, resonate with their customers. Okay, are there any more questions? Right, we've got a follow-up here to the department store question, asking really, is it relevant? Look, this department store question obviously is a tricky one, and I guess we're all thinking about David Jones here. And I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, as we've kind of previously noted, there are very few global success stories. But on the other hand, I'm looking over my shoulder at Amazon, which, if you think about it, is the ultimate department store, in that it is not constrained in any way, shape, or form by space, and it is able to offer up to consumers an almost endless variety of whatever they want. I think the core difference between Amazon and many bricks and mortar retailers, however, or department stores, is the way that it curates that range and personalizes it to the individual customer. And so that's the difference. So my suspicion is from here, for department stores to succeed, is that you need to find a way to use AI or some other form of technology, or even bring back personalized shoppers, to curate those ranges more specifically and personalize them better. All right, then we've got some more questions popping in here. How do you think that companies' stale management have contributed to lackluster growth? Right, that's an interesting question. Perhaps there has been a dearth of new ideas. I think that for many of these retailers, it hasn't necessarily been the lack of ideas, but rather execution, of course, and the macro environment. I think particularly in the clothing space, we've had 4 very tough years because of the credit environment. And I'm referencing there particularly the NCA changes that we had in 2015, which really pulled back the growth in the market. Market in South Africa for some of these retailers has been very dependent on the credit, and maybe that is an excuse for them, but it hasn't helped either. At the end of the day, customers will find the money to buy fashion that appeals to them and resonates with them, and they will scrimp in other places. But again, coming back to what I was saying earlier about it's difficult for designers to do their best work if they're feeling threatened or unhappy in any way. That's probably part of the problem as well. Given the big changes happening at Massmart, do you believe the new management will focus on expanding their clothing offer? Okay, again, really interesting question, because some of the Walmart business that did best in clothing has been Asda, with its George range, and Walmart has now tried to sell George, although it's been unsuccessful for competition reasons. So it is going to be interesting to see. But certainly the previous management team felt that an expanded clothing offer would be part of turning game around. But it is possible that they could shrink it here. From what I understand, their clothing has actually been quite successful in that value space. how do I think that stale management can contribute to lackluster growth? I suppose if you have no new ideas and you keep on doing the old things over and over again, you're going to get the same result. So what I suppose you need is new ideas to come in to see if you can drive new avenues of growth. I hope that answers that question now. All right, thank you again for taking the time to attend. Zoo One Retail Insight subscribers, please keep an eye on your inboxes for some more detailed answers to some of the questions and the topics that we've discussed here tonight. I'm also going to send out a link to you all probably on Monday with the recording, or maybe a bit later today. Thank you again and have a great weekend. Goodbye for now.